Hey everyone, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. It's available on Apple, Google, Spotify, Edify, Liftable. I say this every week, wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this show, you know what to do. Take a moment to review it on your favorite platform, because then more people know about these interviews with our amazing guests. So each episode, I'm interviewing major thought leaders from many fields of influence to show how our worldview changes everything. My guest today is returning to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast, but with a little twist. He's a journalist and a podcaster with the Christian Post, who reports extensively on topics of theological interest in the church, including euthanasia, assisted suicide, artificial reproductive technology, the developments of the gender identity movement, and transgender ideology. And that last thing is what we're going to be focusing on today, because our guest and I have co-authored an ebook on gender ideology. So we're going to talk about the growing transgender movement. We're going to tell you about the book, how you can get it at no charge. It's called Exposing the Gender Lie. Please welcome Brandon Showalter to the show. Brandon Showalter, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
It's good to be with you.
Now,
thank you.
You've been a guest before, and we've been friends since last summer. We connected around the issue of transgender, because this is something, as an investigative journalist for Christian Post, that you have been examining for years now. 5 years, I think. You've been focused on reporting
Almost
on this
7.
issue, and you've been interviewing families that have been affected. You've been interviewing doctors and other medical professionals. There's hardly an angle that I can think of this issue that you have not covered in your reporting. So I'm very pleased that we can be co-authors for a new ebook that is getting a lot of attention, which is called Exposing the Gender Lie. And throughout the show, we'll be telling people how they can get a copy of that ebook. I actually have all my pages printed out right here of what that is going to look like. But I'm grateful for your coming on the show today. I do want to provide a warning because I know sometimes folks listen to this when they're riding around, picking up kids from practice or school, things like that some of the things we're going to be talking about are very sensitive issues. They're very emotional. There are a lot of people who are hurting people, and there are a lot of people who are being deeply hurt. And we're not going to shy away from the difficult aspects. So if you're with your children, this may be one that you want to set aside and listen to another time. We'll help you have those conversations with them, but them listening in at this moment might not be the best. Is that a fair way to start? Yeah.
I think so.
Okay.
It is touchy and sensitive, but that's a good disclaimer.
Yeah. And we're not doing this as counselors. You're doing this as an investigative journalist. I'm doing this as the president of a ministry. We would call this religious instruction. This is not counseling. This is not a substitute for counseling, although there are a lot of counseling related issues that come into this discussion. So with that background, those disclaimers, let's talk for a little bit about why we need to be discussing this as a culture, and specifically because most of the people who are listening to this show they're believers. They're committed believers. So why do we need to be talking about this? I've even gotten that question. Why is Summit Ministries talking about transgender? What's at stake here? So why is it a big deal, and what's at stake? And I'd just love to hear your thoughts, and I'll throw in some commentary as we go.
Well, you're correct that I think it does strike most people as a kind of bizarre subject area. And until you fall down the rabbit hole journalistically, as I did, I think most people sort of compartmentalize it like I used to. Oh yeah, transsexuals, I've heard of them. Transvestites, Mardi Gras, New Orleans, kind of people on the margins. But in the last several years, it has become a subject that people just can't ignore, particularly because of how it impacts children in schools and in the healthcare realm. This ideology, gender ideology, transgenderism, whichever you'd like to call it, has permeated our body politic in all of society. Public institutions from top to bottom have been captured largely. And small O Orthodox evangelical churches, some Catholics, and a few other, Christian institutions, Eastern Orthodox, they are about the last holdouts. They
Hmm.
are the few people, among the few, there are some other voices that are raising uh, the alarm about what's going on that are not Christian, and we can talk about some of that. But there are many reasons why I think Christians, especially, must care about this. One, as it is, I believe, one of the worst medical scandals of all time. Two, children are being subjected to some of the most horrific child abuse, medical abuse the world has ever seen. And three, I think this is a frontal assault on the book of Genesis, and because of that, it's an assault on the entire gospel. Genesis 1:27, being made male and female in God's image, is not agree to disagree territory. It's not a secondary or a tertiary doctrinal concern. If you get that wrong, you get the whole gospel wrong. And I know for myself and for the Christian Post, we're not willing to budge on this. Um, and again, but what I would emphasize for our purposes for this episode, Jeff, is that this is a humongous medical scandal, and thus it's an issue of justice. Christians should absolutely care about how we are made, the integrity of science, the human body, first do no harm. These are things we must care about, and transgenderism brutally assaults all of that.
Yes. Well, we're going to do 3 episodes. So the first episode will be, as you mentioned, introducing the issue, talking about what it is, and talking about why it's the biggest medical scandal of our time, as you mentioned. Second episode, we'll talk about the capture of institutions by transgender ideology and the twisting of language, which is actually an assault on reality itself. And then in the third
Yes.
episode, we'll talk about what a biblical approach is, because we all hold out hope that the gospel of Jesus brings healing. And it gives us,
Yes.
for all of us, it gives us clarity in a confusing time. It orients us to reality. Jesus said in John 8:32, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. The word truth there is the Greek word for reality. That we can actually know what is real. We can reorient ourselves, even if the culture is totally confused. Now, usually, Brandon, I don't have a lot of notes when I do the show. I kind of just keep stuff in my head that I want to talk about. But there's so much to keep in my head that I actually wrote down a bunch of things I wanted to emphasize. Just a couple of bullet points here. The number of people, young people identifying as transgender, has doubled within the last couple of years. Doubled. So we're not talking about something that's 0.01% of the population. The hashtag trans on TikTok, the social media platform, has 50.2 billion views. Well, there aren't that many people on the planet. Most people have never seen it. What that means is there are millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people who have watched the videos about this repeatedly, dozens or even hundreds of times. So they're completely immersed in the social media aspect of it. The number of young people who have been treated at gender clinics has tripled from 2017 to 2001. 42,000 young people were treated at gender clinics. So for those legislators who say, I don't believe this is actually a problem, I don't believe this is actually happening, they need to get their head in the game. 39% of young people, according to some surveys, now identify as LGBTQ. In other words, they don't believe that their identity as a male or female has anything to do with who they really are. Healthline.com says there are 68 genders, and they give the titles for each one of those and define them. And whereas most countries might have 1 or 2 gender clinics, the United States has 300 gender clinics and 60 more that are specifically pediatric clinics. So would it be fair to say this is not just a marginal issue that your state legislator can say, this is all made up, this is not really happening. This is really happening.
Yeah. I think it's probably one of the most frustrating aspects about this issue, Jeff. And it's so horrible and unbelievable that people don't have the categories for it, so they just shut down. It's so unpleasant to think about that this is actually happening in America, which we pride ourselves on having state-of-the-art medicine and that kind of thing, that doctors, don't they take a Hippocratic oath and first do no harm? I hear that all the time. This has exploded. You say 300 some. I think it's probably more than that if you count Planned Parenthood clinics, which are now in on the
Point.
cross-sex hormone distribution game. And who knows if there are other doctors' offices that prescribe. I bet you it's more than that. But yes, we do know that there are dozens of the pediatric gender centers, gender clinics in children's hospitals and other, distinctly pediatric places, but also the other clinics. It's probably state legislatures that don't think this is much of an issue are probably in deeper red states, but it's happening even there too. It's happening in Alabama. It's happening in South Dakota. It's happening in Idaho. Not as much as in, say, California or New York, but it's happening. And so it's red states now that are trying to curtail some of this with legislation. But it is a tremendous barrier to get past this disbelief because unless and until this affects your family, a lot of people have this kind of analysis paralysis that sets in when they realize the scope of the horror. The first pediatric gender clinic in the United States opened in Boston in 2007, and here we are 15, 16 years after that, and people are only now coming to realize just how many children are being irreversibly harmed by this. The way in which the activist doctors have infiltrated the health care system has been so sneaky and stealthy. And so anybody who would dare look would be just sort of brushed off as a conspiracy theorist and you're just a crazy person. Well, now, particularly given your TikTok figures that you just cited, it's indisputably clear that this has penetrated, colonized all of culture. And worst of all, some of the worst victims are very vulnerable, often mentally struggling children.
Yes. And a lot of people are noticing this and mentioning it. Who you wouldn't ordinarily think that as Christians we might be aligned with. For example, when we did the poll asking Americans, do you think that transgender, the agenda has gone too far? The vast majority said yes. More than 70% said yes, they think it's gone too far. Fox News asked a transgender activist, Buck Angel, do you think it's gone too far? And this person said, yes, I think it's gone too far. Kate Harris, who is a lesbian feminist from the UK, a leader of a gay and lesbian organization in the UK, said, this is targeting children. This has gone too far. Simon LeVay.
Yeah.
Okay, we talked about Simon LeVay when we were writing the book because this was the guy who said homosexuality is genetic. We all remember that research from the 1990s. He has come forward and said, you cannot be mutilating children before their puberty has even had a chance to be completed. Bette Midler, J.K. Rowling, both people who have been avid defenders of the LGBTQ movement, have both come under serious criticism because they have questioned the targeting of children. They've been called transphobic. They've been, all kinds of horrible things, vile, despicable names they've been called because they have just dared to take a simple stand to try to protect kids.
Yeah. It's unreal, the vitriol that's been hurled at J.K. Rowling, but I think she's probably the most famous person to be as bold as anybody has been. And she's, I think, when history is written of this whole saga, J.K. Rowling's advocacy is going to be an important marker. She came to the defense of a woman by the name of Maya Forstater in, I think, December of 2019, which really signaled that she was on the side that was opposing the transgender radicalism. But then in 2020, in the summer, she put out a lengthy essay over 4,000 words describing the medical scandal aspect of this, but also the threat that trans activism poses to women's rights. And I think it's going to, like I said, it's going to be a very important marker in history because someone of her stature and prominence and fame is not going along with all the other famous people, basically. But you're also correct that there are plenty of gays and lesbians, bisexual, LGB identified men and women who have contacted me over the years, radical feminists also, and ordinary Democrats. They're in my voicemail, my inbox very frequently, desperate. Some of them are atheists, and they ask me to pray, to tell me they think they believe in demons now because when this has invaded their home, they don't want their daughters going to Planned Parenthood to get testosterone and wind up sterile. They're just absolutely horrified, and it upends everything that they thought they knew and could believe. Some of them vote Republican for the first time in their lives because of this, though I'm not advocating that they necessarily do that, because I've seen some awfully craven behavior on the part of the Republicans, but that's another conversation for another day. But your material point that this is bringing a wide swath of people together is true, indisputably. Most people don't support this, but they have very cleverly hooked their wagon to a lot of other popular, more politically popular causes, and that's why they have been able to advance as much as they have.
Yeah.
But no, the masses do not support this. But what is particularly insidious is that the mass media insists upon framing this as a right versus left kind of fight, when the reality is far more complicated because, again, a diverse chorus of voices has arisen in recent years adamantly opposing this madness, and rightly so.
You know, in the ebook that we wrote together, Exposing the Gender Lie, you provided a couple of quotations that I think are really interesting from evolutionary biologists who are on the left, firmly on the progressive left, and they're evolutionists and they're atheists. And their quotations saying that if we continue down this path, we will lose our collective tether to reality,
Yes.
should be a wake-up call, especially for people of faith. If someone who's a leftist, progressive, evolutionist, atheist can see what's going on, it seems like we ought to get our head in the game.
He's correct. The quote that you're mentioning there about losing our collective tether to reality is Colin Wright. I've met him in person. He's a very neat guy. He's speaking the truth. Human beings are sexually dimorphic mammals. This is basic biology. There are only two sexes. There is not a third gamete, period. That's just basic science. And I find it so interesting that we live in an era when we're told as Christians who believe in God as the creator that we hate science, when they are the ones peddling this junk. There are many different kinds of genders, and that's actually scientific. No, it's not. The ideological capture, which we will speak of in another episode, is humongous. But I think the worst part of this denial of sex, this denial of science, is that when you have that at the root, you're going to have a medical scandal. If you're denying the basics of biology, well, of course you can't even have accurate information about how to treat disease, or how to even think about gender dysphoria, or where that's a psychiatric comorbidity for a mental health struggle. If you don't even believe that, biological differences are a real, indisputably true thing, how in the world are you going to even approach, prescribing some sort of medical treatment that has profound implications for the male and the female body?
Yeah. Well,
it's reality.
It is reality. Yes, and there is hope in the gospel. We'll get to that in the third episode when we talk about talking about this issue. We will get to talking about the institutions and the abusive language as you mentioned, but we wanted to sort of set the groundwork here, and some of the things you've mentioned here that are startling about the medical aspect of this. Well, that's actually one of the things that made me want to work with you on this project, was when you said, look, I think this is the greatest medical scandal of our time. And I thought back to other medical scandals, the eugenics, forced sterilization in the 1900s. I thought about lobotomization. I thought about the treatment of anorexia, using steroids to try to treat muscle dysphoria. I thought, the opioid crisis. I thought of all of these things that were in the 1900s, the greatest medical scandals of that century. And this is the one for the 21st century. This is really it.
And I think it is that because it's set apart in that this medical scandal is marketed to our youth as an identity.
Yeah.
I don't know of a single other medical scandal. You mentioned lobotomies, or thalidomide or opioids. When was that attached to this notion of who you are?
Yeah.
And I think it's helpful to frame the subject of transgender in medical scandal terms. One, because it is a medical scandal, that's just plain fact. But when you realize that children are being permanently medically harmed, like let's think about this has attached itself to all sorts of alphabet soup of LGBTQ plus, and so people, they have the conversation about civil rights and political rights, that kind of thing. When you're involving the medical industry in this, that's a discussion about medical care and health care and psychiatric and care and counseling. But if you can distract the public from making this about, identity or civil rights, the medical harm just continues apace. So I think it must be grounded in fact that these are material falsehoods being pummeled into young people's heads as though they are somehow real, and their identity is attached to these are fictitious, medicalized identities that they somehow must adopt in order to become their truest, most authentic self. That's the lie that permeates this medical scandal that I think makes it so dangerous. I've never seen a medical scandal like it because when have we seen this marketed to people? There wasn't lobotomy identities or thalidomide identities. Like this has never been a thing.
Yeah.
But now young people on TikTok and social media, they've come to believe that unless they can acquire cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers or undergo a surgery, that they somehow won't be who they were meant to be.
Yeah.
That's just that's beyond anything that we've ever seen before.
It is beyond everything. I appreciate your bringing clarity to that issue, and we want to make it clear we're not attacking young people who are struggling with their identity.
Amen.
That is not what this is about. Young people struggle with their identity. Young people have always struggled with the issues of identity. We have compassion on people who are struggling, and we want to walk alongside of them to help them find a place of health. But what we're talking about in this episode in particular is the intentional and specific deployment of what we call the medical industry and also the pharmaceutical industry to reap billions of dollars in profits by convincing children that they were born in the wrong body and that somehow using medicine they can be fixed.
Right.
Does that about summarize the issue?
That's perfect, because that is the lie that's at the root. It's a tremendous con job. If you can convince someone that they need this product, then they're going to be set free from not only their distress, but it's all wrapped up in it is a social contagion, a fad, a craze, call it whatever you'd like. But this is marketed as the pathway to liberation and to becoming your truest identity. And I think it's in this milieu where we have such family breakdown and we have such relational fracture and disruption, and the ground is ripe, unfortunately. I think it's just so. When you talk about this, people's eyes sometimes glaze over, and you talk about big pharma and big medicine making profit hand over fist, lots of money. Sometimes people like, oh, that's just a conspiracy theory. People talk about big pharma, you're just putting on a tinfoil hat. It's like, no. In the ebook, in Exposing the Gender Lie, I was very deliberate to highlight the investigative work of my friend Jennifer Billick, who has perhaps, I think, more than any other investigative journalist in the world, traced the revenue and the money sources behind this. She's got the receipts. She has done her homework. And I mentioned a speech that she gave, Jeff. It was probably just a few weeks before we met. She was here, or it might have been a day or so after we met in Tucson, where she elaborated on what the costs of puberty blockers are. Mm-hmm. And she's found how if you have a subcutaneous implant implanted in your arm to halt a child's normal, natural puberty, and then that child is on it for a few years. If you get a whole swath of children on those drugs, we're talking about thousands of dollars per child, and that's just the blockers. Yeah. Then you had the hormones, and then the surgery. Matt Walsh and his crew at the Daily Wire exposed Vanderbilt, where one of the people on staff at that hospital said on tape that these transgender surgeries are a big moneymaker. It's coming out of the horse's mouth. Like, there's a lot of money to be made when you're offering medical treatments or medicalization, again, based on completely false premises. There's nothing wrong with these healthy bodies that are being drugged and disfigured. And because of that, it's going to need a lot of follow-up care to either repair the damage or continue to do more damage. And meanwhile, they laugh all the way to the bank. This makes a lot of money for a lot of evil people in the medical industry.
Let's try to be as specific as we can in the time that we have remaining in this episode. We know that the transgender medicine standards of care. Okay, so doctors don't know everything about everything. They look at what are the standards of care that my industry has operated by, and then there's safety for doctors in that. Because if there's harm that results, they can say, "Hey, I was just following the standards of care." Okay, then they can escape legal liability. Those standards of care are highly choreographed, and you and I've read them. It's a 48-page document. We give the citation in Exposing the Gender Lie. You can read them for yourself if you want to. They're highly choreographed and they're very specific. You start the child with a social transition, which is they change their name, tell you what pronouns they want to be referred by. Then you tell their parents, you refer to them this way or else. You tell their teachers, you get everybody in the class to refer to them this way or else. That's the social transition. Immediately followed by, as you mentioned, puberty blocking drugs. So drugs that would be used to treat prostate cancer in men, endometriosis in women, Lupron primarily. And you know, just yesterday I met a guy whose life has been saved because of his Lupron treatments for prostate cancer. So it's not that this is a bad drug, but it is used off-label without FDA approval to block puberty in children with long-term, very serious consequences. Okay, and that's the first step. Then the next step is, so you do this to the comfort of the patient, is what the standards of care say. So if they come back and say, I'm still struggling, then you take them to the next step, which is cross-sex hormones. That would mean giving testosterone to girls, and I assume it would mean giving estrogen to boys. And
Estradiol and spironolactone, yeah, some combo of those, yes.
And
Right.
the goal would be, it is a predicted outcome that this will make a person sterile. Is that correct? If they go through that
is
process
correct.
of puberty blocking drugs, then they go on to these cross-sex hormones, they will never be able to have children.
Almost a guarantee.
Almost a guarantee.
Yes.
Okay. In the standards of care, strangely enough, note this: the Pediatric Endocrine Society actually, they have 6 main recommendations that they give. And one of them is give the patient some briefing on reproduction. And what that means is let them know that if they go through this treatment, they will never be able to have children. Okay, they're supposed to actually alert them to that, even though, a child who's 14 or 16 may not even be capable of grasping what that means for their lives.
That's right.
They actually, the Pediatric Endocrine Society goes on to say, if this doesn't solve the problem for boys, then you should amputate their gonads. It's actually in one of their main recommendations. So this
It's so chilling. Yeah, it's so chilling. You're not being hyperbolic at all, Jeff. I mean, these standards of care, a lot of them, what you're talking about, are coming from groups like the Endocrine Society, Pediatric Endocrine Society. The American Academy of Pediatrics has a model of how they follow that is very much of the gender affirmative or gender affirming, always put that in air quotes, pathway for children who are battling this mental health condition or who have been swept up into the social contagion largely fueled by peer groups and internet and social media. But they are fast-tracked down this highly experimentalized, medicalized pathway. But it's just so, even I've been in this for years, Jeff, but even hearing you articulate that still continues to send shivers down my spine, because these are otherwise perfectly healthy bodies that are being subjected to this experiment. You don't cut the physical body part off to heal a mental disorder. You don't hijack your hormone levels just in pursuit of something that is physically impossible. I mean, I am not a psychiatrist, but I don't know of a single psychiatric condition where you would deliberately take your sex hormones out of balance, which is what happens when you exogenously pump your system full of synthetic cross-sex hormones, how that would then alleviate a mental disorder where it makes no sense to put
nowhere
your hormone
else,
levels out of balance.
nowhere else in our world would we recommend that you mutilate someone's body in order to heal their mind.
Right.
Now,
And I know that we'll probably talk about this in one of the episodes that we do about institutional capture, but we'd be remiss if we don't speak of what a group called WPATH, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. When people wonder, like, how did this all happen? I always used to trust the AAP or the Endocrine Society. Well, this is a group of activist doctors that have
Yeah,
come on the scene and infiltrated and made their way into these otherwise what legacy sort of trustworthy organizations and revamped guidelines, professional guidelines in the last 15 years to the point where you know, they're unrecognizable from decades ago.
that's right.
These vaunted, respected institutions have been completely taken over by this group, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And there's some really scary things. I don't know how much detail we want to go into about that, but they even have eunuch as a gender identity in the most recent iteration of their standards of care, their guidelines, I believe. They even had a eunuch, as though eunuch was a gender. I
Right,
mean,
right.
it's unbelievable the kinds of stuff that's coming out of that group. But they are the source of a lot of this ideological takeover, otherwise trustworthy institutions, or what people used to be able to trust.
That's right. So what's been happening here is, and again, you want to read this ebook. It's free to you. Just go to summit.org/trans and you can download it. There's no charge for this. It's not like we are making any money off of this. We just wanted to sound the alarm. Exposing the Gender Lie is the name of the ebook. And in the process of putting this together, we realized several things. First of all, that the biological reality is what people are actually beginning to question. So we're dimorphic, as you mentioned. Every human being is either male or female. If you're female, every single cell of your body, except for your reproductive cells, has an XX chromosome. If you're male, has an XY chromosome. There are 6,500 catalog differences between males and females. It's not like the biology is really in question. But and when we talk about the ideological takeover, we need to talk about why people now say gender assigned at birth, as if the doctors somehow make a person male or female, and that medicine can unmake them. That's the big lie. And it's crazy that young people would believe this, but they are. They actually believe that if they're a boy and they take this medicine, they can become a girl, or vice versa. Whereas that's a biological impossibility. That's not what happens. What happens is all of your systems get really messed up, causing you lifelong health complications and probably aggravating all of the mental health comorbidities that lead people to this kind of treatment to begin with.
That's absolutely right, Jeff. And concurrent with this medical scandal is the indoctrination of children within the school system. And I think this medical scandal, the medical malpractice, would not have the legs that it has been allowed to have in so many institutions throughout our society, but for the corruption of the education system and especially the journalistic malpractice. I say this all the time. The medical malpractice has been enabled by journalistic malpractice because of the way in which they have basically taken the ideologue's word for it, and they've deferred to WPATH and these other captured medical institutions. But the harm that doctors are doing, the puberty blocking and the administration of cross-sex hormones and the surgical amputation of healthy body parts, now broadcast as liberation on social media platforms and called gender-affirming care, all that's been allowed to happen because of the brainwashing and the indoctrination of a generation and the manipulation of language, which I know we're going to talk about soon too. But the medical scandal has been enabled by all of those things because they have a protection racket around these doctors that are carving up bodies and, permanently, irreversibly harming young, vulnerable, often mentally struggling young people. They've been allowed to do this because of a multi-pronged effort to hoodwink society into believing the big lie that somehow human beings can change sex. No,
Yeah.
you cannot. You can't cut off body parts to change sex. You can't take hormones to change sex. It is stamped in the nucleus of every single cell of
Yeah.
your body. Period.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get into the ideological capture, by which we mean how this agenda manages to take institutions like government and the education system and use it to promote a message that leads to not only tremendous profits for the medical industry and the pharmaceutical industry, but also leads to grievous, irreversible harm for young people. Listen, to everybody who's watching or listening, I know this is startling information. We want you to get the ebook, Exposing the Gender Lie. Just go to summit.org/trans. You can download it for free there. You can share it with other people. Let them go to that link too. They can download a copy. It's available free to everyone everywhere. Listen, I know a lot of people don't like to read, so they're so busy, but this is 60 pages with more than 100 pieces of specific footnoted documentation in the ebook, because we know that some of what we're saying is going to be very hard to believe, and we prove it using solid academic studies and investigative journalist research. So all of the evidence is there, and this is the medical scandal of our time. Maybe this could be our opportunity to, by speaking the truth, reverse course and protect our kids.
I think that is absolutely right. And I would just say to those who are listening or watching as well, if you're thinking, well, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, medical issues are over, are over my head, I can't really speak with any kind of authority over them, I would remind you that Christians have a storied history of speaking out against unethical medical practices. Like, even if you don't understand the specifics or the nuances of endocrinology or surgical care or biology, maybe you're not a scientist, that's fine. You can still speak out as your conscience leads you. And if you do the research more, you read our ebook and you see what you see, it really is not a question so much of how much knowledge you have, that can help, but it's a question of courage. Because I tell you, I sometimes get emails from Jewish readers who read the Christian Post, and it always just gives me the shivers when they draw the analogy. Jewish people themselves talking about Dr. Mengele, and during the World War II era in the Holocaust, he experimented on children. This really isn't so different. And I'm always hesitant to draw analogies like that, but I'm hearing from Jewish people themselves who say this to me. And other people can see it plain as day too. When you are experimenting on the human body in pursuit of a physiological impossibility, in pursuit of a lie, only horrific, irreversible carnage is the result. And I know I won't have it on my conscience to see this widespread harm and not say anything. The Christian Post feels the same way. Thank God for my great editors who are very godly, and they feel the same way. Christians, it is incumbent upon you to speak out and to arm yourself with the truth and stick up for the vulnerable. And if you're more social justice inclined, this is the biggest social justice issue there is. If ever there was a case of the powerful pitted against the weak, it's this. It's big pharma, it's big medicine, it's ideologues in power who are preying upon the mentally struggling, sometimes same-sex attracted, autistic, depressed, and anxious young people, fueled by tech. This is the epitome of the strong versus the weak. Stick up for the vulnerable. Speak out for those who have no voice. We cannot stand to have a generation that is surgically disfigured and mentally fractured by this evil ideology. It has to stop.
Yeah. Well, you've said it very well. Truth itself is on the line here, and we are to speak justice. I was thinking of Amos chapter 5, where Amos says, "Woe to you who long for the day of the Lord. Will not the day of the Lord be darkness rather than light? It will be like a man who flees from a lion only to have a bear confront him. He goes home and rests his hand against the wall only to have a snake bite him. Will not the day of the Lord be darkness rather than light, even deep gloom without any brightness in it?" And then he just goes straight at people for saying they are living out their faith when they're not standing for justice. He says, "I hate your feasts. I despise them. I can't stand the stench of your solemn assemblies. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice flow down like water and righteousness like an unending stream." That is the message for our time. So those prophets are amazing, and it's worth going back and reading them because they directly confront evil, and that's a very difficult thing for people to do because you might offend someone. You might not know exactly what to say, and you might end up feeling a little bit silly. You might end up being canceled. But the question is, are you going to let that stand in the way of speaking the truth? So exposing the gender lie, summit.org/trans. We want you to get this, share this with other people. And as I mentioned, we're going to get to this in our third episode together. We're going to talk about how this is a gospel issue and how there is hope in Scripture. But first, and in the next episode, we have to talk specifically about how this has captured institutions and is a very intentional, purposeful agenda, not only to cause children confusion about their gender, but to undermine the very idea of truth itself. So we'll get to that in the next episode. Thank you to my guest today, Brandon Showalter, for joining me on the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. You know, in the opening chapters of Genesis, God creates male and female, man and woman, to be his image bearers as part of his good creation. We need to defend the innocent and expose the lies that distort God's good design. Thanks for tuning in, and join me next week as I continue the conversation with Brandon Showalter. Listeners, I want you to know that our podcast is on Edify, which is a truly powerful app that brings together thousands of the best Christian podcasts in one place for your listening enjoyment. You can download it at Edify, EDIFI.app. Be sure to share this show if you have enjoyed listening to it. And leave a review, if you would, on the site where you download the show. That helps more people know about the Dr. Jeff Show. And I'll look forward to seeing you next week.